I was living in a house in Laurel Canyon, and Russ Meyer came to visit with a friend, an old Army buddy. Russ asked me, "What are you doing?" I told him, "Well, I've just been down to San Diego working with a naval officer on a World War II naval aviator story, in which he'd had a really foul-up squadron." And he said, "Oh, that reminds me of the Dirty Dozen." I said, "Who were they?" And he told me, a group of court-martial prisoners in a stockade in the south of England a few months before the invasion. Some sentenced to death, some to long sentences, and they were given an opportunity to participate in what would amount to a suicide mission. He had been sent to film them. He found them dirty, bearded, foul, obscene. He filmed and he turned in the footage. About 2 months later, he met some of his superior officers in France, and he asked, "Whatever became of those guys in the stockade?" And someone said they all perished in their mission. I said, "Gee, that's a fantastic story. I'd love to find out more." So Russ and I began to contact people he had served with in the Army. I began to build a body of research. I found old digests of court-martial cases. And as I read, I kept wondering, is this guy, is it this guy, is it this guy? It could be him, yeah. But never any confirmation. I continued research as I was writing it. It took me 4 years to write the book. My hope was that I would find the actual people, but I never did. I've recently heard about the group called the Filthy 13, led by Jake McNeese. I was not familiar with that group, at least not by that name, nor did I know the name Jake McNeese.
Jake McNeese is just a poor country boy from Depression-era Oklahoma. Jake felt he needed to be a part of the war, and if he was going to be, he wanted to see the most action that he possibly could. So he volunteered for the parachute regiment. Jake volunteered and became a member of the 506th Airborne.
They used to laugh and tell the story that they had a 3 weeks crash course for paratroopers, when they would take 1,000 men and examine them, and they'd separate the men from the boys. And the second week, they would separate the fools from the idiots. And the third week, they'd take those idiots and jump them 5 times and make paratroopers out of them. And it was considered a suicide unit, and they anticipated the loss of 50% on each mission. When you go in an infantry unit or an artillery unit, you may be sitting there and they'll open up on you with artillery from 8 or 10 miles beyond your range, and there's no way to fight them. But in parachute units, when you jump in behind the lines, you're in the middle of them. You are pitted against a man, not an artillery unit or an air corps that you have no way to combat at all. That was the way that I wanted to fight.
Jake was a troublemaker, all right? He joined the Army for one reason, to kill Germans, all right, to fight. And he could not identify with Army discipline. He could not see what saluting officers, what picking up cigarette butts or standing formation had to do with training a man to fight.
But Malcolm says, first time I ever seen McNeese, he's coming down the road with 2 MPs on him with a shotguns on his behind, Who the heck's that guy? That's McNeese. So that's maybe the first introduction to this character.
I went in just to make a contribution, if I could, to the war effort. And I didn't go for all that close order drill and stand and retreat and all that.
Fellas came back and said he was at a reunion, and one of the officers said, I don't believe that stuff in the book about not saluting and calling them by their first names and all. Well, we did.
Our attitude was that we were there just to conduct warfare and not to use a bunch of military discipline and so forth. All the training that they had that was absolutely beneficial to me pursuing war, I engaged in it 100%, and I excelled in it.
When you look all through American history, there's always a suspicion of the professional military, of discipline, of military regulations, and this feeling that the citizen soldier, based on his own inspiration, his own abilities, can overcome, can accomplish the mission, that he doesn't need a bunch of crease-pantsed West Pointers to tell him what to do.
There are more books written by or about members of the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment than any other airborne regiment in World War II. And there's a lot of really good regiments out there, like the 509th or the 504th, that have fought from North Africa, Sicily, Italy on. But what made the 506 unique is that experience they had at Toccoa.
The 506, which was the first parachute infantry regiment that was ever trained as a regiment, and they called it Colonel Sink's Muscle College. And you trained as much as 12 to 14 hours a day, and most of it was physical training and conditioning. We had 25 and 30-mile field marches every night in wooded areas. We used to march 40 miles down to Clemson and take our target practice and fire different weapons and do our bayonet practices and that sort of thing. We'd stay down there 3 or 4 days and train, and then we would make a night march back 40 miles to our camp at Toccoa. We had a mountain there outside the camp. They called it Mount Currahee. That's an Indian word which means we stand alone. And it was 3 miles up and back, 6 miles up and down together, and you had a change of elevation of 1,000 feet from the base to the top, where you finished your mileage on the upward climb. We used to run that every morning before breakfast.
I've always had problems breathing. Even today, I only got 40 on one side and 60 on the other, but man, I was huffing and puffing getting up that mountain, I'll tell you that. But every day we ran the mountain, ran the obstacle course, and if you didn't make it, you're out. That's all there was to it, you know. For the amount of people that were assigned to the 506 and the amount of fellows that we dumped on the way, you know. We call them rejects, but many a time since that time, we wish we had those men because they were good men. They just didn't make the grade.
There were 6,000 of us that was trying to qualify for this thing. Out of the 6,000, there was only 1,500 of us that made it.
When you weed out that many, what you're left with is a hardened group of men that could probably handle the experience of the horrors of combat a little bit better than say, even the Ranger battalions. For example, the Rangers, one of the most elite units of World War II. Very few of those guys will talk about their experience after the war. The 506, you can't get them to shut up about their experience.
During our training in Toccoa, you know, running into Jake here and there and running the obstacle course and all. And eventually I went over to the 1st Battalion section, which was Jake's section. See.
I was a demolition saboteur man. I had worked in construction and knew and understand tensile strengths of iron and metal and concrete. And so I went into it because we would be going to be used to blow up bridges, and buildings, and railroads, and engines.
We were demolition and all, and they want no parts of us guys. Sometimes you're walking down the street and they see those idiots, they could cross the street and go down the other side. They didn't know when we were going to yell. Or you go into a place and just for devil won't yell, fire in the hole. Man, those guys are under the tables and everything, you know. They didn't know if we were going to set up a charge or not. They marched along the road and throw me a stick of dynamite. And those guys would all duck, you know. We blew tops of trees off them and everything else, you know. And that's when Joe Oborowski got killed. And a week later, I got blown up. But being an Irish, it just bounced off, you know.
Beginning in probably 1943, we began a massive buildup of American personnel and material in England. The cross-channel invasion became the #1 objective of the Western Allies, and is going to be the buildup for the cross-channel invasion that we know as Normandy, at Normandy on D-Day.
The Americans and the British couldn't set about defeating the Germans unless they got onto those beaches of Normandy. It was the beginning of the Western War in Europe.
When they got to England, the demolition section that Jake belonged to had their own Quonset hut. Because the officers reside in their own quarters, you just have the 13 enlisted men in the Quonset hut. They were undisciplined. They didn't like cleaning the barracks.
We were only permitted to take 1 bath a week, a cold shower. And so we never ever went to the shower. You'd spend 2 or 3 hours waiting your turn to get in it. And we would just pack our dress clothes and everything in a bag and run on into town.
He took his guys and ran into town, into London, went to the Red Cross building and showered there. And so the Red Cross people, you were used to seeing these filthy paratroopers. I mean, keep in mind they were sleeping on these mattresses that were made of corn shucks that Jake would say you could slap it with your hand and this black dust would come up. So imagine how filthy these guys looked. I'm sure that one of the local workers in the Red Cross building asked why these guys were so filthy, and someone made up the story, well, we've sworn not to take a bath until we jump into Normandy and kill the Germans. The Red Cross workers saw these filthy paratroopers coming in and didn't recognize these clean paratroopers going out. So they believed these guys had sworn not to bathe for that 6 months. So that's part of the myth.
This theory that we had taken this oath, you know, and blood brothers and this and that, and that we wouldn't shave or clean up for 6 months prior to the invasion, that was all a bunch of hocus pocus. We didn't shave during the week. We never did wash our clothes. We just never even considered washing clothes.
No good leader tolerates unsanitary habits. It's bad for the unit. It makes people sick. It's unsanitary. However, you get yourself into situations at war where you can't afford water to bathe. The only water you've got is water you need to drink. Or it's just too miserable in terms of the conditions to do much about keeping yourself clean. Now, the Filthy 13, the guys from the 506th, 101st, were they just being contrary? Maybe. Ask McNeese and those guys about that. I think they probably just didn't care a whole lot about glitzy garrison soldier appearance. They cared more about getting the job done. They cared more about soldiering. They cared more about surviving.
The Filthy 13, the easiest way to describe it is Jake McNeese and 12 accomplices, men who would, without hesitation, do whatever he did.
They were the finest group of men that I ever was associated with. You could trust them absolutely implicitly, and you could depend upon them if you wanted to charge a machine gun nest or something. All you had to say was, let's go.
Every other sign on the barracks, Filthy 13, and everybody was in our barracks said they were in the Filthy 13, but they weren't, because the Filthy 13 section was 1st Battalion section, Jake's section.
The thing that made these guys probably famous outside of the 506 was that jump into Normandy. Now see, Jake is 1/4 Choctaw. The lieutenant had a little bit of Indian blood, but other than that, Jake's the only Native American in his demolition section. And so he has been building up his Native American roots to the point that it becomes part of his own legend. Well, getting ready to jump in, he decides to shave his head.
And the guys asked me, they said, what are you doing? And I said, they all knew I was part Indian from Oklahoma. And I said, in Oklahoma, when we go into combat and fight one another, I said, we wear a Mohawk scalp lock. And I said, whoever loses, the other guy gets the scalp lock to wear on his belt. I said, it's a war trophy. And they said, oh my goodness. They were most of them from up in New England, in that area, and they was eating this story up in good shape. And then I laughed and I told them, I said, oh, we're going to be in where you can pick up body lice by the handfuls, and I said, they're going to be hunting hair on your body. So I said, if you cut your scalp lock like this, I said, if you come to a cow track that's full of water, I said, you can wash your head, get rid of them lice.
Jake had foresight to see those things, the same thing like shaving our heads going in Normandy. They said, a pack of idiots. But Jake had enough foresight to realize that reading about First World War. All these guys got lice and everything in their hair, you know.
So just before we started to jump into Normandy, they decided that they would paint visible insignia on all of our aircraft to avoid friendly ground fire.
He went over to the plane where they had those black and white invasion stripes freshly painted on there, took his finger, wiped off the black and white paint, and drew circles and lines across his face.
I just took this paint off of the planes, it's still wet, and I camouflaged all their faces to reduce their visibility at night.
He calls that camouflage, but it sure looks like war paint to me. And when the rest of the guys asked him why, and he came up with this silly excuse for why he did it, almost all of them copied him without hesitation, okay? That is what Jake McNeese was.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely.
D-Day was an immensely complicated operation, perhaps the most complicated military operation ever undertaken. You know, you put 170,000 men into landing ships and take them across the channel and put them down on the beach and walk them in, or let them walk themselves inland. 3 complete divisions of parachute soldiers, let's say nearly 20,000 men on parachutes, dropping into enemy-held territory. 3,000 British and Americans were killed on D-Day. It was a fraction of the number expected. Of course, it was a huge casualty list and an awfully tragic day, but it was also enormously successful. The reason that it was successful was that, first of all, the men were very carefully selected. They were all volunteers. They'd been trained to a very, very high standard. They knew exactly what to do.
As we were approaching our drop zone, the plane that was carrying my stick began to be hit very heavily with ground fire. We began to catch so much fire, and I became a little fearful that we were going to lose so much altitude, our chutes wouldn't open. I ordered the boys to bail out, and we bailed out about 8 miles from the bridges we were going to destroy. Well, the Germans, the night that we jumped in there, their automatic weapons, about every 5th round of it was tracer ammunition. It looked like a 4th of July celebration. And it looked like a stream coming up at you, you know. It was just that close together. And you could hear it hitting the silk of your shoe. And you could have reached out in any direction and caught a handful of it. We landed right outside St. Mary Glees, where the famous Band of Brothers, the E Company, was fighting. And we bailed out there and had to go on down 8 miles to get to our bridges. And that's where we lost so many men.
And they thought they were going to go and whip hell out of everybody right away. You know, it didn't work that way, because we found out a hard way that, hey, these people have been at war for years before we got there. And the ground we were trying to take, they know every inch of it. See? So no matter where you went, whether it was in Normandy or Netherlands or Bastogne, they were there first and knew what was there. Every foxhole in the ground, you know. We were at a real disadvantage, and we didn't realize it right from the scratch.
The Filthy 13 had a reputation from the beginning of the war on through, and a lot of the boys that came in wanted to be with the Filthy 13. It was quite an honor, and they knew that officers didn't fool with us, that I provided for the guys real good. I could butcher anything, you know, and we ate well, and we fought hard. So a lot of the new replacements that came in had already heard about the Filthy 13, and they wanted to be a part of it. And I never asked a man of mine to do anything that I didn't engage in. I led my group everywhere we went. I was always point man. And I did it for a couple of reasons. It gives them confidence in what you're attempting to do. And besides that, I had a lot more experience than any of them, and I could analyze the situation better.
Certainly an ability to overcome fear is an absolutely crucial factor in being a good soldier. And some people do seem much readier to overcome fear than others do.
When we came back out of Holland, we had fought up there for 78 days behind enemy lines without any resupply or anything. When we returned out of that to Mormelon, France, they gave me a pass for 72 hours, which wasn't even an hour per day that I'd been behind lines. And they gave me this pass to the little city of Mormelon. And Mormelon City and Camp Mormelon were adjacent to one another. You could stand with one foot in the camp and the other in Mormelon. And it was a small town. It had about 10 cat shops in it and about 10 bars. And we had lost 70% in Holland, and they had moved in replacements, just young kids from the States. And they had never seen much of that foreign living yet. And so when I got my pass and stepped into the city of Mormelon, they were lined up. You couldn't even see the end of the line from every bar and every cat shop in Mormelon. So I told Frank Coe, the boy that was with me, I said, I'm going AWOL. I said, if you stood at the end of the line and took your turn, I said, you'd never get close enough in 72 hours to wink at a woman or drink a glass of beer. So I said, I'm gone. And I took off and went AWOL for quite a while and returned to camp and reported in, and they put me under arrest quarters until they could decide what to do with me. Shorty Milan, who was Colonel Sink's orderly, came in my barracks where I was under arrest and asked me how I'd like to go to England. And I said, go to England? I said, is that where they're going to hang me? And he said, Jake, he said, what they would like for you to do is to volunteer for parachute pathfinding duty.
A pathfinder to this day, but beginning with the development of major airborne forces, the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, during World War II, was a specially trained paratrooper who could go in a very small unit ahead of a massive drop, like the kind you saw in Normandy with the 82nd and the 101st on D-Day.
They primarily would be called into play for tactical missions, which means they are in support of a military engagement.
In other words, it's ground guidance for the airdrop, either whether it's glider troops or supplies or jumpers, you know. But that's ground guidance is what it amounts to.
They were the leading elements of the parachute divisions, which dropped first.
Usually at night, and clandestinely by parachute, jump into a zone and set up beacons, set up sometimes radio beacons, sometimes visual beacons, that pilots of oncoming aircraft could spot and thus make sure that they dropped either their cargo or their personnel in the right spot.
It was a pretty tough assignment, and they usually lost 80 to 90% of their personnel on each mission. And it was entirely voluntary. Because of the high rate of casualties, they could not assign a man to it. They had to ask for volunteers to come in. And of course, men was in a lot of trouble and so forth. If they did volunteer and go in, they dropped all charges that they had against them.
Gene Brown, who has by that time become the company commander in Holland, asked Jake to volunteer for it.
I told him to let me think it over, and I'd give him a reply very shortly. And this was early in December, just before the Battle of the Bulge. And for all practical purposes, it looked to me like the war was over. It's just a matter of Hitler surrendering. And I thought they'll never use Pathfinders again.
He thought he would probably be getting out of the rest of the war by going back to England and sleeping between clean sheets, eating good Air Force chow.
They were stationed at Shawgrove, England, which was just 8 miles out of Oxford. And that had the biggest university in Europe in it. So there'd be more women and more whiskey there and less fighting than anywhere over there. And I thought that'd be a good place to go do a bunch of undergraduate study.
Jake figured, hey man, I get over there and get back to London, I can do some hell raising, you know, so he decided he's gonna go for this Pathfinder thing. And
Gene Brown was smart, and the whole idea of talking Jake into going, because he knew if Jake went, all those other troublemakers would follow him out, which they did.
Majewski was a guy that they also wanted to get killed. And they said, what about Majewski? Will he go with you? And I said, I'm not going to encourage Majewski to volunteer for this. I said, y'all talk to him. So they talked to Majewski, and then Majewski came over, and I'm packing my bags and everything. He said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm leaving in the morning. I'm going to England, pathfinding service. And he said, well, you're crazy. He said, that's 90% chance of getting your ass killed. And I said, Max, I don't think they'll ever use them again. And I said, good location, everything there. Women and whiskey and no fighting. I said, I'm not trying to be a hero. I said, I think this is the coward's way out. And he said, you may have this figured out right. He said, I think I'll go with you. So he went down, volunteered, and then Jack Agnew heard about it. And Jack had made 2 jumps with me already. And he said, if McNeese is going, I'm going too. So he volunteered, and before the night was over, there were 5 demolition men and 1 officer that decided they'd go with me.
Lieutenant Schrabel Williams came in asking why half the original members of his platoon that had survived Holland were volunteering for Pathfinder duty. When Jake explained it to him, Schrabel Williams himself volunteered to go into Pathfinder duty because they all thought that would be neat ideas, sitting out the rest of the war in England. Well, they weren't over there 2 weeks before they received a call from the 101st to come in and bail them out. The 101st had got caught at Bastogne.
The battling bastards of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, were trapped in that area. Winter, bad weather, snow, no flying weather, no way to break through. Germans surrounding them and pinching. They had to hold out in Bastogne. It was desperate because Bastogne was strategically, tactically vital. Was an area in which 7 roads leading all throughout that area met. Control that area, and you control all of those roads.
And the longer they could hold Bastogne, the better opportunity they had to defeat the Battle of the Bulge, because Germany couldn't supply anything that was beyond that city, because we were controlling the main artery of highways and railroads.
So the 101st Airborne Division was grabbed and said, you will hold this at all cost. Unfortunately, they were out of beans, bullets, and bandages. They were down to a few rounds for each individual rifle. They were desperate for resupply, but the only way to get resupply in was by air. And so, Pathfinders from Headquarters Company, the 506th, McNeese among them, got sort of volunteered from their base where they were undergoing Pathfinder instruction in England, put aboard C-47s and dropped into that Bastogne area with their special beacon equipment.
you know, on the 22nd, when the encirclement was closed in Bastogne, completely surrounded, we were in the air in England with one airplane. And the mission was aborted, and I said, what the hell are we going back for, you know?
We could tell by the time that we were in the air that we had missed Bastogne and was on beyond it, about 35, 40 miles. So we wheeled around and headed back to Shawgrove. We sat down and went in the war room to discuss it and see what we could do, next best opportunity. And I suggested that we take 2 sticks of Pathfinders in on the 23rd, the next morning.
They decided, hey, we better take 2 planes. One of us gets shot down, we have another plane there, see. In later years, I found out that a Pathfinder unit back in France would be alerted if we didn't accomplish our mission, if we lost out, see.
I would be in the lead plane, and when I dropped out, if I saw that there was any possibility of entering into Bastogne and setting up a resupply, that I'd throw out orange smoke grenades. Orange color is a friendly force with the military, and that the second stick of Pathfinders would drop right in on top of us. If when I got out in the fog enough that I could see, there was an impossibility to get in and set up, that I'd throw out black smoke, and they would try to find another area to drop that plane load in. And I didn't have any confidence in the success of it at all, but they brought in a colonel, and they said he could fly in there without navigational equipment and drop me in Bastogne. And I still didn't have any confidence in it at all. And the next morning we loaded up, took off 2 plane loads of it. And they had 1,000 C-47 cargo planes loaded with equipment, circling and rendezvousing over France, waiting to see if I could get a signal to them. And Colonel Crouch called me up in the cockpit, and he said, "Sergeant, you don't have much confidence in this, do you?" And I said, "How about changing that much to little or none?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I can drop you in there if you can do your end of it." He said, "I'll do mine." He said, "I'll put you in Bastogne." And I said, "Well, I hope you do." And he said, "Let's synchronize our watches." And we synchronized our watches. And he says, at 9:15, he said, "I'll pull down out of this fog and we'll be right over Lille, France." So we flew along till 9:15, and he pulled her down out of that fog, and we were right over Lille, France. He said, now at 9:42, he said, "I'll pull down and we'll be over Brussels." I said, "Well, let's see." So at 9:42, he pulled her down, and we was right on Brussels. He said at 10:15, he said, "I'll give you a green light and you jump and you'll be in Bastogne." So at 10:15, he pulled her down. And when I got in the air where I could see, well, I saw that we was dropping right between the 2 front lines, the Germans and the paratroopers. So of course I threw out all the orange smoke I had, and they dropped the other 10 right on top of it. And there was a big graveyard right on the edge of town. Had these huge stones in it like most of the Catholics use. And I started slipping my chute and guiding toward that stone. We were dropping in front of C Company, and the minute they saw us and the Germans were trying to knock us out of there, they opened up with everything they had to button up the crowd. And we got on the ground and got in that graveyard and worked on into Bastogne. And in 30 minutes, we had our CRN4 sets and our lights and our panels out and had contact with the planes, 1,000 of them that was over France, circling to see if we could see them. And in about 45 minutes, the first planes arrived and dropped all this equipment in on us. And in 3 days, I ran my sets for 3 days and brought in 1,440 tons of equipment. Ammunition, medicine, food, everything we need to fight with.
The resupply drops came in. They picked up the Pathfinder's beacon and were able to drop supplies, ammunition, replacements, medical personnel into the beleaguered 101st Airborne Division and kept them alive and in the fight until Patton finally broke that encirclement and the Germans overextended and shot their wad in the Ardennes offensive.
And what history tends to overlook is that these airborne resupply drops didn't come in because the clouds miraculously parted. You know, that allowed the planes to fly, but no one really knew where the German lines ended and the American lines began.
5 of the Filthy 13 were part of that crew that, I'm going to say, saved Bastogne, because we went in there on the 23rd. Patton didn't get there to the 26th. So Patton didn't save Bastogne. Our guys were shooting back, chasing the crowds before we even got there.
That is rated as the most successful and important combat mission of all military history of the United States. And the 101st Airborne was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for a division, the only time that it had ever been issued up to then, and it's never been issued again. It was a complete success. They recommended that the Pathfinders be awarded the Silver Star for their participation in it. This Colonel Crouch got a Silver Star out of it. And they recommended that each one of us Pathfinders be awarded the Silver Star. And Colonel Sink, of course, got to have his approval. He said, hell no. He said, just give them another Bronze Star. He said that's what we expect out of our people. So I got 2 Bronze Stars in the Battle of the Bulge.
After the Bastogne jump, when those guys finally went back to England, Jake said that Colonel Zink sent a message to the Pathfinder company. It says, you send those guys back over here, evidently I can kill them off faster than you can. Well, the company commander allowed all his 506 guys to go back except for Jake McNeese, because even though Jake's still a busted private, the man's a leader. And the company commander had turned to Jake to be his acting first sergeant.
Jake stayed on, and they made another jump that you never hear about. So Jake and I, up to Bastogne, were the only ones that had 3 jumps. And some of the 82nd may have had 3 because they've jumped in Africa and Sicily and Italy and the Netherlands, you know.
But there's only 2 of us that lived through 4. The average lifetime of combat paratroopers was just 1.5 jumps. We had some replacements come in at the last of the war, and one of them asked me, he said, McNeese, he said, have you ever figured out how you made 4 jumps, lived through? I said, yeah, I think I know. I said, I was the biggest goof off the Army ever saw. And I said, at that time, I said, the Lord only had 2 places he'd put people, heaven or hell. And I said, he didn't want me in either one of them, afraid I'd mess it up.
I went to a regimental headquarters company 506 reunion, and what I learned is these guys were telling better stories about him. Jake was really who he claimed to have been, and I've been attending their reunions ever since, and everybody has a Jake McNeese story. There's no doubt in my mind, in talking to everybody in Regimental Headquarters Company, the 506, that Jake was the toughest man in Regimental Headquarters Company, possibly the toughest man in the 506. Now, how do we go from the Filthy 13 to the Dirty Dozen? I believe it began with these photographs that circulated of a bunch of men who had shaved their heads with mohawks and put on war paint. To this day, people who see those photos would love to know who they are. And there's been kind of a mystery behind it, right? And it actually wasn't stills. There was a cameraman, a motion picture cameraman, who was walking along as the 101st was loading up on the airplanes and caught these guys on film. And they took stills from that and circulated them in magazines. Well, a number of war correspondents then went after the story. And keep in mind, these guys have already jumped into Normandy and are in combat. And the journalists are just following this trail of myth and rumors. And that's where a lot of the embellishment begins. I think this one reporter was able to capture a number of these guys after they came back from Normandy and interview them. So he got another piece of the story, but it was a war correspondent by the name of Arch Whitehouse, who wrote for True magazine, who probably did the best and final embellishment of the story. And in his story, he has just 12 men, and they're called the Dirty Dozen. And they're all full-blood Indians, and they're the most undisciplined soldiers there are, and they're not going to accept any leader. They get assigned a lieutenant who has to individually whip each one of them to earn their respect. And once he has earned their respect, then of course, they go from being the Dirty Dozen to the Filthy 13. Now, when I talked to E.M. Nathanson, the author of the book, The Dirty Dozen, he said that he had read an article like this, but it wasn't in True magazine, so it wasn't, or I don't believe it was Arch Whitehouse's article, but it was an article like that published in another magazine.
After the book came out, particularly after the movie came out, this is a few years later, I began hearing from people all over. I'd get letters from guys who say they ran into such a group, they know it isn't fiction, it's fact. Then I got two fascinating bits of correspondence with photos in them. One from a radio man aboard an aircraft that had dropped a group like the Dirty Dozen. And he sent fuzzy, tantalizing photos, nothing that you could really say wow about, identify. And then there was yet another man, a photographer, an Army photographer, who had shot pictures on an airfield, hundreds of miles from where the first man had identified a Dirty Dozen group. And he sent me fuzzy pictures. Nothing you could really put your finger on, identify. You can't even really see the faces and say, oh, that's old Joe, you know, that's so-and-so, that's Murphy, that's Donovan. They may have been McNeese's group, I don't know. But he and his group were never a source of the research that I used for the Dirty Dozen, which came from court-martial records, training manuals, individuals who were in charge of prisoners like this, and out of my own imagination.
It certainly happened in the German services, where the Germans would form what were called punishment battalions of men convicted of either of civil crimes or military crimes, and put them in these battalions with the offer of better treatment if they succeeded in what they were told to do.
Had the Filthy 13 stood up before their commanding officer and been punished for one infraction or another? Yes. That infraction was probably drunk in public or creating a nuisance or being absent without leave. But under no circumstances were they in some sort of prison under a death sentence or under a 30-year non-commuted penitentiary sentence. I think people like McNeese, who was indeed one of the Filthy 13, would vehemently and wholeheartedly object to a connection between the Filthy 13 as he knew them and Aldrich's band of convicted criminals and psychopaths, sociopaths, in the Dirty Dozen. So that connection needs to be severed.
You know, in the movies, they made out like the 101st was a bunch of jokers. I was kind of perturbed with that, and I didn't know for years that Jake was approached before. And he said, no way, we're going to make money on those guys we lost.
This is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
I think a good soldier, I think he's a person who understands that in a military context on a battlefield, the sun does not rise and set on his ass. and that what he does has solid, significant repercussions on the people to his right and to his left. He's a person who understands that there are certain things in this life that are worth sacrificing for, perhaps even dying for.
I have prayed in the presence of my family and my children and many other people. I thank God for the fact that our borders and our shores have not been invaded by foreign enemy for many, many, many generations, and that our women folk and our children and our elderly have not had to witness carnal warfare in their front yard. And for the fact that although that we had 450,000 men and women killed over there, and that we have 80,000 that are called MIAs, missing in action, that this nation enjoys the most privileges, the most prosperity, and the most security of any nation that history has known, and that every bit of it has been worth the rewards and the liberties and freedoms that we still maintain.